Yeah, so my name is Chris Tanzer, so I'm the director for our cyber investigations and response team at McKesson. So I have about 18 years experience in IT generally, around 15 in cybersecurity specifically, and 10 of those in IR. Lawrence?
Hey, Lawrence Taub here. I run the strategic consulting practice for Mandiant for the Southeast United States. In that role, we're focused on the security program, how to improve it, test it, build it, and enhance it in various ways. Been doing that for several years. Before that, I was doing IR for Mandiant, and I don't know, somewhere around 15-something years, security all in. So just wanted to start it off with a disclaimer that, we're Mandiant, McKesson, we work with probably most of these companies that have the big breach. We're not going to be talking specifics about any of these breaches. We're not talking about them. So if you're here hoping us to bash companies or anything, we're not doing so. Just wanted to disclaim that and set the stage up front a little bit.
So after Lawrence says we're not going to bash any companies, we have a list of some companies that have had some major healthcare breaches over the last year or so, right? So, anybody that's read a newspaper or online blog, anything like that knows healthcare has been particularly victimized over the past year, right? This is just a small snapshot of some of the major affected organizations. Everybody's, kind of heard of most of these at least, right? And, like Lawrence said, we're not going to be taking a deep dive into any of them in particular, but what we will be talking about specifically is how healthcare is a little bit different than most other industry verticals, specifically around the interconnectedness of all the organizations within healthcare, right? And this means that when one large organization, like you see here, has an incident, there's at least a dozen others that are also going to suffer and probably have their own incidents, right? Anybody in the healthcare space can probably agree with that.
All right, and then, just talking about some of this, why we're focused on healthcare, why we're kind of calling it out as opposed to just making this a general IR talk. As Chris mentioned, these healthcare incidents have a broader impact. These organizations are critical, right? They're critical service to the communities that they're serving. Some of them, of course, are critical, much broader than just a single smaller community, and they're affecting a global audience. The outage at one, right, for whatever reason it may be unavailable, is straining the others. Many of these organizations are operating in the consumption and the production model. They're providing out information to smaller healthcare organizations, such as we see sometimes like the health records might be at a large hospital, and then they're giving that service to smaller clinics in the same state. I see that frequently. Of course, healthcare being critical to the specific community, right? If a hospital is unavailable and we're rerouting patients from that hospital to another one, the quality of service may decline for people's healthcare. These incidents and the recovery of it tends to be a lot more complicated. It's complicated based on the systems that are in the hospitals, the nature of all these various organizations that are interconnected. As Chris mentioned, right, that it's this web of organizations. When one goes down, all the others are impacted. And then one that I've seen particularly impactful is that if there is an outage, right, these downtime procedures, yes, they're great, and the healthcare staff can operate in downtime for a little while, but when it starts being weeks or months, you're putting a really inordinate strain on that workforce, and the quality of care goes down.
Yeah, in reality, downtime procedures at most healthcare organizations are made for maybe 1 to 4 days, right, at the most, right, in the best of cases, a week, right, but they're not made for 6, 7, 8 week long, incidents that are going to impact them, right. One of the stories I like to tell, I had started at McKesson. I've been here for a few years. I was maybe at McKesson for about 6 weeks or so. And there was an outage that was caused by, I'm not going to talk through it, but, I had that next weekend I was out playing golf with my best friend I've had since high school. We was best men at my wedding. I've known him for 20 years. When we were just talking through things while we're on the golf course, and he, starts talking about his week and how he was getting blood drawn at an oncology center because unfortunately he was going through some things at that point, and he had to come back later that day because when he showed up at his appointment time, they couldn't see him because they couldn't check him in, right? And I was like, oh wow, that was one of our oncology centers. And, so my day and what I was doing that day was directly impacting my best friend of 20 years, right? So it really put into perspective for me, what we do in healthcare really matters, right? And that there is a very specific impact on the individuals that are receiving care, and it's not always good.
All right, so start this off with a comic. Has everyone seen this before? Do you remember this comic? I remember it from my childhood, these highlights magazines. I think both of us had the same experience, totally didn't grow up together at all, but both our grandmothers would buy this magazine subscription for us, and you've got Goofus and Gallant and I think Gallant, I don't remember how you say it, and then you've got Goofus on the left running with the scissors pointing up and always doing the wrong thing. Gallant is on the right, always showing the right way to do things, and I don't know. We liked it, and sort of how we're going to base the rest of the presentation.
Exactly, right. I probably learned a little bit more from Goofus than I should have, but hopefully those of you here today won't be learning from who we came up with for this.
So our variation, we've got our two characters we're going to introduce. We've got Get It Done Gary on the left there, and Security Conscious Steve. So that's our Goofus and Gallant from our presentation. So you'll see them throughout the presentation. We're going to use them to kind of tell the story.
All right, so we're going to use the NIST IR lifecycle, the latest revision out of SP 861 to kind of backdrop everything that we talked through, right? Because any good IR team is kind of using this in terms of whether it's their incident response plans, their procedures, right? This is how we do things, right? It's the typical cyclical process that revolves around security incidents and kind of informs how we do our jobs, right? My big thing that I always tell our cybersecurity team as a whole, no matter if they're in governance, no matter if they're doing whatever they're doing, it could be a firewall admin, right, is you're in the incident response game, right? Because you're either preparing for an incident, trying to prevent one from happening, or you're responding to one, right? In cybersecurity, that's just the reality, right? You're detecting and responding to it. And we're not going to be given an in-depth class on the NIST framework, right? But what we are going to do is pick out some very specific portions of it and where we think it applies, most specifically in the healthcare realm.
It's going to serve as a vehicle for the upcoming slides.
Exactly, as you can see here.
So starting off in preparation. So, Gary, we're going to talk about risk identification first. Gary doesn't worry about risk ahead of time. Of course, Gary is aware that there's risks, but he's just so busy, right? He just doesn't have time to spend on dealing with these risks. And, it's a common problem that people they're always fighting the fires, they're chasing the next big thing instead of spending the time to build out the risks and deal with them. It keeps them up at night, but just moves on.
Whereas we have Steve, right? So Steve categorizes and prioritizes his risk, right? And he not just knows his internal risk, right? Which is kind of the more traditional thing that organizations think of when they think of risk. Things like your vulnerability management program, data loss prevention, misconfigurations, those kinds of things. But he's also worried about external risk, right? And external risks are some of the factors that are really hard to, one, record and quantify in any measurable way, right? Because there's often just a lack of knowledge about, one, what's going on in another organization or what's going to happen in the near future, right? 3 years ago, not a lot of people would have predicted that there would have been a war between Russia and Ukraine, right? But there is, and that impacted a lot of healthcare organizations because there was a lot of outsourcing that was done in Ukraine for creation of products. So, things like new government regulations as well, right? SEC disclosures that we're now required to do, and all those kind of things affect organizations and are part of the external risk equation, right? And those are just some examples of that. But also, one thing Steve does very well is he documents any interconnections that he has with any third party, right? So whether that's a vendor that's coming in through a VPN to a specific piece of OT gear that he might have in his environment, or whether it's a customer who has an environment within one of his cloud tenants that serves an EHR system. Steve is very good about categorizing those things and prioritizing the risk and documenting those. Right? Now, when it comes to documenting systems and partners, right, Gary just kind of lets the business run rampant, right? He tells the business, hey, whatever you need to effectively run your business, you go ahead and do, and maybe come and tell me about it afterwards, right? This doesn't mean that he might not document, that a system exists, but he definitely isn't documenting, that or an interconnection exists, but he's definitely not documenting any criticalities. He's not labeling them, not doing any of that kind of stuff. It's really hard. He doesn't bother doing it. It would take a lot of time.
And on the other hand, Steve keeps detailed documentation on all aspects of the environment. And frankly, this is hard. This is really hard, right? It's always changing. The environment's always evolving. And sometimes that change happens without your knowledge, right? Other teams are making changes and they're not letting the security team know. That's unfortunately a very common reality. Even still, it's extremely valuable to know what is in your environment, for IR to be able to answer questions during the investigation, but even during other routine IT practices to be able to answer these things and understand it. You got to understand any externally owned systems, right? When we're talking about healthcare, it's really common that you're going to have your various OT devices, the X-ray machines and monitors and things like that with these vendors that are managing it for you. And they're part of your environment whether you control it or not, and they add to your risk. So understanding what your level of control is, what this level of connectivity is, right? How are these partners coming in and managing it, doing updates, doing routine maintenance on these systems? Understanding, unfortunately, many of these systems are kept back on old operating systems, right? Windows XP or something like that is good enough for this monitor, and if you update it, well, we're not going to support you anymore. These are common situations with these healthcare OT devices. One of the things that I always advise is when you're thinking about these things, you have to have that big red button, right? If something goes wrong, how are you going to lock out these third parties that are in your environment and say, all right, I don't know where my problem is yet, but I don't need people complicating it. I don't need another avenue. Or if the problem is outside, right, there is a breach at a partner, being able to shut them off and cut them from your environment, which to protect yourselves. If you are with these systems in your environment, you need to understand how you're going to investigate these systems. Have a plan. Do you have access to them? Do you have to go through a third party? These are all questions to ask ahead of time. And then again, the theme of this, right, documenting it, putting it all in writing, understanding it, keep it updated. All right, and then again in this preparation phase, know your data. So Gary doesn't understand the data that is in the environment and how it supports the business, right? Similar to what we were just talking about with the systems, you've got all this data in there and people are changing it without you, your knowledge. It's hard. It's hard to keep track of that data.
Right, whereas Steve, he's going to document the entire life cycle of his data, right? And when it comes to, that life cycle and what you need to know about your data, I took a journalism class, I think in high school, because there was a girl that I liked and, I wanted to talk to her a little bit, right? But in that journalism class, there's one thing that stuck. Exactly, right? I actually did learn something, and it stuck with me, and I kind of apply it to everything, right? And that's the 5 W's and an H, right? The who, what, when, where, why, and how, right? That's what you need to know about most things, but it's especially important when it comes to your data, right? You need to know who creates your data, who owns your data, who accesses it, who transmits it, all those different kinds of things, right? You need to know what your data types are. Especially in healthcare, this is extremely important. You need to know what systems are hosting things like PHI or PCI or PII, right? Especially if, like McKesson, you deal in the EU and some of these different jurisdictions, right? Because a lot of that stuff changes. You need to know when your data is going to be created, when it's typically going to be accessed, so you can look for things outside of the norm. And then you also need to know when it should be destroyed, right? You don't want to keep PHI records around for years and years and years after they're no longer needed, because that's just a risk that you don't need anymore. You also need to know where your data lives, right? Both at rest and in transit. If you're transmitting, extremely sensitive or regulated information with vendors, partners, or customers, right? You should probably know about that. And you should probably know what's my normal volume of data transmitting across this link is, right? That's probably a pretty good indication that something's going wrong. If all of a sudden it's at 0, all of a sudden it shoots up 500%, right? Those are big indicators that something's going to go wrong. You need to know why your data is created in the first place, right? Why is this data important, right? Why is, and that will kind of tell you what the criticality of the system that it's on and why it's important, right? And the most important thing is that you need to know how your data supports the critical business processes to your organization. You can know those 5 W's and you can know everything, but if you don't know why it's important to the business, it really doesn't matter at the end of the day.
All right, moving us on to detection.
Right, so like he does with systems and like he does with the data, right, Gary's also very lackluster about documenting the interconnections that his organization may have with those vendors, customers, and partners, right? Gary doesn't really view them as third-party risk because he trusts that people are going to do the right thing, right? Because he thinks he does the right thing.
On the other hand, Steve provides limited access to the environment as needed and documents it. I think that documentation is definitely a theme here.
Yeah, it might be.
I mentioned earlier about the interconnectedness of healthcare and the community connect of the health records, and it's a necessary evolution of our industry that this is happening. But the other hand is you're giving all this access to people into your environment. There's various connectivities. Understanding all of that, understanding everything that's going in, everything that's going out, knowing those various interface points, and then thinking about them. Do I really need to give you a full VPN connection? Right? Security professionals have been hearing least privilege, least access principles. I think those the first time I saw it published was in the 70s. So that's old, right? And we still don't do it. So, think about those things, do it, and do you really need full VPN access, or is an API good enough? Is there some metered interface that you can provide that is much more limited? Segment these third parties from your environment as best you can to limit their access. Whether it's your incident or their incident, you don't want it to be spread further. That's part of the risk here.
And also monitoring.
Yes.
So not even just segmenting those things, but monitoring what those people are doing, right? That's all part of the detection aspect.
Yep. And then understand the access, what's normal, understand it so that when there is some incident and you're looking at it, oh man, look at all this data moving. Well, that's a daily backup. Of course there's all this data moving. People, when you're dealing with these situations, you don't want to be jumping at shadows. That's creating more noise than you need. And then of course, over time, things change. So you want to be continuously validating, making sure that you don't have configuration drift and someone didn't just grant some extra access for troubleshooting and whoops, left it on.
Technical debt, is that a thing? I don't know.
All right, so containment. So we're going to talk a little bit about automation. Gary does it by hand because that's how they always did it in that org. And Gary would love to automate, but who has time for that, right? There's all these things going on. We're fighting fires. You don't have time to do that.
Right. Steve, on the other hand, he took the time to lay out all of his IR processes, right? He knows from start to finish what needs to happen and all the steps in between. And so what he was able to do is look at those individual steps and say, where do I have technology where I can automate this step? or automate that step, right? And at the end of the day, right, he's trying to, reduce the time that it takes for him to get his big four main metrics, right? His time to detect, his time to contain, his time to recover, and his time to close out his incidents, right? He wants to get from start to finish of his IR life cycle as soon as possible, because he wants to get that healthcare organization back up and running as soon as possible, right? Because we're talking about, like we talked about at the beginning, downtime procedures are only made for a very short amount of time, right? So the more that Steve can automate, the more that he can do those things, the faster he's going to be able to get through his life cycle, and the better care that his organization is going to be able to deliver to patients, right? At the same time, you have to be very careful when you're configuring automation, right? Especially when we're talking about things like system isolation for containment, automated blocking, or alerting on vetted IPs, hashes, mutexes, those kinds of things. And you need to make sure that you have very pinpointed out the specific steps that need human interaction for decision making, because it's very easy to get overzealous and automate decisions that can lead to consequences, like taking out a healthcare organization that actually wasn't going through the incident, right? Maybe it just wasn't documented properly or something like that. And now you're impacting patient care by you not doing the automation process the right way, right? At the end of the day, automation is just making decisions based on the data that's presented to it. So if you don't have good data going to it, you're not going to get good results out of it.
Yeah, you don't want to get the call from the CEO in the middle of the night, why is my computer not working? Stuff like that.
Yeah. Or, accidentally block an entire /8, because you were like, oh, well, there was this article that said, this is, typically, China's IPs are typically in here, and, we don't do business in China, so that's okay. We can just block that, right? Not saying I've seen that before, but I've seen that before.
All right, third-party relationships.
All right. So when an incident happens at a third party, right, Gary just kind of, he doesn't really care about what's in the Wall Street Journal, right? He just kind of assumes that if, this other organization has an incident, they're going to do the right thing. He thinks that, hey, look, it wasn't on my systems, right? It wasn't anything that I can control. So what harm could it really do to anything in my environment, right? It'd be a lot of work to try and talk to people and understand what's going on. And, he has a poker game tonight at 5:30. So, it's time for him to get out the door. Ignorance is bliss, right? That's Gary's kind of approach.
And Steve realizes that they're part of a web of organizations. And I like to focus in on the extremes of things. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples of communications. On one side, I've seen a victim organization communicate by attempting to live blog their incident. They had videos from the CEO. The other side is probably one that everyone expects happens a lot, is the complete denial. Sweep it under the rug and pretend nothing's going on, nothing's happening. Probably the right path is somewhere in between. I don't think either of those is those are the extremes. Sometimes the right path is being chosen for you now with the increased regulation around disclosures and especially healthcare being such a regulated industry. There's a lot of focus on that. But when you reveal, whether it's to the regulators or your third-party relationships, that's important. And then how much do you reveal is important. It's important for these organizations to be partnering, truly partnering, sharing indicators, sharing awareness of what's going on. And in some cases, it goes against the instincts, right? To sort of turtle up and forget about everyone else because you just need to deal with your own problems. But it's important to be able to share those indicators, and you're going to get a lot of requests if you're the victim for it. And if you're adjacent, you're going to make those requests. Everyone's thinking, could this spread to me? And so sharing these indicators, sharing the events, making people aware quickly and promptly, and as they update, will really help to protect that web of organizations.
Yeah, I bet Steve is very active in his ISAC, right? He's definitely very active in HISAC and sharing IOCs and getting vetted IOCs from other healthcare organizations. All
right, taking us on to recovery and critical systems and dependencies. And Gary doesn't prioritize the systems in his environment and thinks they're all the same. And of course he doesn't think they're all the same, but it's too much time and effort to go through and prioritize and the changing list of systems and priorities. And it just doesn't seem like it's a fruitful effort for him. But if everything is your top priority, then nothing is your top priority.
Yeah, transversely, right, we have Steve, and he's going to rank the systems in his environment based on their criticality to business processes, right? Depending on what's important to his business, right? So number one's always going to be patient care in healthcare, right? What business process supports patient care, right? And then we have all those other things like profit and other things that we'll think about after the fact, right? But really, what Steve is going to do is he's going to have a really good CMDB, right? In his CMDB, he's going to have things like a list of all the different systems, all the data that's on them, and all the processes and other systems that are dependent on them, right? He's going to have a criticality ranking of that system, either automatically or with manual intervention, that talks through, hey, this is the order in which we need to do things, right? If you start bringing up systems, but you don't have Active Directory up, right? You're going to cause some problems, right? So they have a plan, they know what they're going to do, right? He's also got documented owners of systems and a list of key stakeholders and users, because it's really important that you need to know who to call at 1 a.m. when something happens, right? What you don't want to happen is, 8 o'clock the next morning, a bunch of VPs start calling you and be like, why didn't you wake me up? Hey, we could have taken care of this before the start of business today, right? So it's really important to get all those things. Some of the other things he's going to have is, hey, is this system internet facing? Is it internal only, right? That'll give him, a risk level on those kinds of things. He might even say whether or not it has MFA on it, right? Because that will let your threat intel team know what they may need to look for account takeovers on, right? And this kind of data is obviously really important to IR folks. But at the end of the day, it's also important to your IT ops folks, your DevOps, SecDevOps, all the opses, right? They all care about all the data that's in the CMDB, so it's really good for everybody to have it, right? So just do it.
Yep.
Right. And when it comes to the backups and restoration, right? Gary, he does his backups, right? He, puts a tape deck in and, takes it out every night. But he's not really validating or testing them with any kind of regular basis, right? So this means that when an incident happens, what Gary's going to do is he's going to go into the box of tapes that's in the server room, and he's going to pick up the first one he sees, and he's going to pop it in. Because at the end of the day, he's about least amount of effort, and he just wants to get the organization back up and running as fast as possible, period, right? After all, that's what it's all about for him.
And everyone has backups now, but Steve is going through testing, validating the backups regularly, and even performing restoration exercises to make sure that things work. It's become important that we have good backups, right? Things happen, even if it's not an incident-related thing. If it's someone accidentally deleted something or a server failed in some form and you need to restore. It's important to have these backups, but if we're not testing them, we don't know that they're there, and if we're not testing the process, we can't accurately give an estimate on how long it'll take to restore. Having the ability to arbitrarily restore a few terabytes of data, that's hard. It's not just click a button always, and you being able to say, oh, this is going to take 10 minutes or this is going to take 10 days, that level of effort is going to be important to the broader team. So this is something that we put this graph together. I feel like it's a really common problem that we see when we're dealing with these incidents and getting back online with these backups. So I'm going to try this laser pointer. So all right, so here, this is our date when the initial attacker access was identified through the investigation. Over here, that's the most recent backup. If we were to restore something more recent than the initial attacker access, then there's a possibility the attacker can come back. Maybe they've got compromised credentials, maybe they've got backdoors on the systems. If we go back here, something older, now there's more data loss from the backup to present day. So that ideal zone is going to fall somewhere in here Obviously, the width of it may vary depending on the organization's backup practices and frequencies and so on. But choosing that date is going to be really important to not having to do it all over again and not having to spend lots of time restoring data from that intermediate.
And one of the most important things is that, what I've seen, and I'm sure everybody who's dealt in IR for any amount of time has seen, businesses are very overzealous about getting things back up and running as soon as possible, but the IR process has to be played out, right? You have to be able to find the root cause and be able to say, this happened at this time, right? Because if you don't know that initial attacker access date, you're just throwing darts at a wall and hoping that you find the right date and that you're not reinfecting systems that have, scheduled tasks that are going to call right back out, to whoever's infrastructure.
All right, and then attestation letters. So Gary expects his partners to just trust him. Gary's been working hard on his investigation, and it's been a tough experience, and he really, he learned a lot. And come on, just I already spent all my money on this incident, and just trust me. Let's get back to business. Let's connect again.
Steve understands that sometimes you need third-party experts, right? If you guys haven't guessed it, throughout the theme of this is there's a lot of interconnectedness in healthcare, and when an incident happens to one, it happens to many, right? There's definitely a one-to-many relationship in most incidents that we see that have any kind of scale, right? And that increased interconnectivity and that increased reliance means that critical business processes are often interrupted by very valid containment measures, right? Steve, though, what he's going to do is he's going to require that there's a third-party attestation so that he can make informed risk decisions when going back, and recovering from that incident, right? From the containment measure, whether that's termination of VPNs or whatever it may be, right? Steve also knows that he needs a standardized methodology, that he needs to create a documented and repeatable process for differing types of third-party exposures, right? And what I mean by that is, it's one thing if an organization may have, like a BEC or something like that, so you block their email domain for a few days until, they come back and give you the third-party attestation that their O365 environment's been cleared, right? That's a few days. It's a completely other, situation that you also have to account for where one of your major vendors or business partners has a ransomware attack that takes down 90% of their organization, right? You need to treat those two things differently, and your process needs to be able to account for those, right? Sometimes that third party is going to fight back, and they're going to say, hey, we are business partners, we have contractual obligations, whatever it's going to be, right? But at the end of the day, like I said, it's a risk decision, right? Whether or not you're connecting back to that organization and how you connect back to that organization, whether it's the same as it was before, is a risk decision that your business needs to make.
All right, conclusion.
All right, so, like I mentioned, right, at the end of the day, healthcare is extremely similar to other highly regulated industries when it comes to things like, working with your ISACs and, the detection process is pretty much the same, right? They're just a bunch of Windows, Linux, and Macs, right? But it's the impact, right? It's the interconnectivity between organizations and this web of, different things that are going crazy, and it's the impact to you, the people around you, and people everywhere.
Yeah, and it's we showed those examples of the incidents over the past year, and just we didn't build this at the end. We actually were in the middle of that timeline somewhere when we came up with this presentation and started building it. It's just things kept happening in this industry. Every one of those impacted lives in some way. And they may have been a direct healthcare provider. They may have been indirect to the healthcare being provided to individuals. And when that gets disrupted, people are impacted. Incidents become a question of when, not if. So it's important to be prepared and ready to respond as best we can. And hopefully everyone here is a Steve and not a Gary. And I think Steve's an aspirational character. But there's a lot of things that we can do and do better across the industry.
Yeah, I know I can be a Gary sometimes, but it's all right. All right, thanks.
Thank you. right, are there any questions?
So when you talk about data in motion, and you're talking about it going across a wide area network, how does Steve do it?
Ooh, see, that's a hard thing, right? So one, Steve's always going to encrypt everything, right? And Steve's going to be able to monitor at his boundary for where data is going, right? So he's going to be able to say, one, this link that I have with this third-party organization, right? So, company A and company B are doing business, they're business partners, and, there's PHI data that has to be transmitted between them on a regular basis. One, Steve is gonna know that. He's gonna have it documented. He's gonna ensure that all of the proper policies and everything are gonna be applied to it, right? So, when we think of least privilege, it's also about, whether those VPNs are terminated at the firewall, he's gonna only allow the specific ports and protocols that are required. He's going to know what typical volume is going to look like, right? That's a big one that we found in our organization. Is it's pretty easy to find out what normal volume is across different links, and to be able to say, give me anytime there's a variance of, let's say, 45 to 65% of normal traffic volume on this link at this time, give me an alert, right? A lot of times, it's very things can be found that, hey, no, this is a legitimate thing, right? There's a, hey, there was a one-time thing that we had to do because of new downstream business partner or something like that. But one of the very specific things, outside of kind of the normal stuff that you're going to find is that traffic volume piece and being able to monitor that. People think that that's really important from an IT ops perspective. Extremely important from especially from like a cyber threat hunting perspective.
And I'm going to go back to, we've had a bunch of these secure file exchange platforms. The Kiteworks, that's what's Excellion. There's Move It. I don't remember. There's like 3 or 4 of those that have happened in the past few years. And I'm going to answer the opposite of your question. Sort of the Gary is, we've seen a lot of people will use those platforms, put data there, someone else grabs that data, and the data just lives there. And that's the sort of the Gary answer is hey, that's easy, it works. It's a secure file transfer, right? It's encrypted on the platform, it's encrypted traffic, but we're leaving that data there. It's persisting too long, and we're not cleaning it out. We're not doing all the things that we should be doing for security best practices to ensure that should something happen, as we saw with those incidents with the secure file software, that someone can't just come in and scrape away all that valuable data that was being placed there because it was valuable data.
Yeah, and I think one of the more important pieces too is that it's extremely important to engage with the business owners, right? And the business leaders that are responsible for whatever process that data supports, right? They need to know, one, they can give you insights that, you may not know, right? About, what it's used for, why it's important, those kinds of things. But that engagement with, the business folks is extremely important as well.
But encryption for sure, but it's still going across layer 3 public internet, right?
Yeah, and that's, yeah.
Or SD-WAN, it's still layer 3 where all the bad actors live.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some kind of inherent risk, right? So, once data leaves your boundary, right? Once it hits the other side of your demarc point, right? There's always going to be risk involved, right?
Why not privatize?
I mean, that's an option for sure.
Yeah, there's many examples of incidents, and actually the first investigation I ever worked at Mandiant was an impact to insurers and the labs that were doing it. There was some small biller that had their data, and it was compromised, and that data ended up leaked. That small biller went out of business, bankruptcy, and shut down. Who still gets sued? The insurance companies still get sued, right? The data leaves your hands. It's got your data, your branding, your name, whatever it is, traced back to you. You're still liable. It's part of the challenge of I don't know, modern legal system. and litigious societies. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.